Hi, I'd like to talk to you today about plagiarism. Whenever the word plagiarism is invoked, most people tend to tune out because they think of the intentionality behind it, the ethical breach, and just assume that that is something that they would never engage in. And for the most part, that's true. But we often encounter students who have engaged in plagiarism and never realized they had done so. So today I want to talk to you briefly about how we as an institution define plagiarism, talk about our expectations for our students, and go over some of the most common mistakes that students make when it comes to the issue of plagiarism. But first, let's look at a working definition. What is plagiarism? Plagiarism is basically taking credit for someone else's work. It's passing off as one's own the ideas and actual wording of another's published or unpublished work. Now this can be intentional for some people. Let's say students pressed for time, has to get work in, and just takes shortcuts. It can be an ethical breach at times, but for many students we've encountered, it's unintentional. It relates to weaknesses in their research, their critical thinking, and in their writing skills. Let's take a moment and talk about some of the most common mistakes students make. The first being improper quotes. The rule of thumb that should always be applied is this, that whenever you quote a source, either in part or in whole, you must do two things. First, bracket the statement in quotation marks, and secondly, provide the proper footnote citation. Quotation marks convey to the reader that the idea, as well as the wording of that idea, is not your own. Now, if you have to quote a source that is more than 2 lines or multiple lines, then it's preferred that you use block quoting as opposed to quotation marks. In either case, a footnote is required. It's helpful, too, that you think about the reader when you're writing a paper. And think of quotation marks, block quotes, footnotes, and so on as signposts or indicators to the reader. Directional signs that help them navigate through your paper, to help them understand and to be able to differentiate between your thoughts and the thoughts of another, your words and someone else's. Let's look at some examples of improper quotes. On the left, you will see original source material taken from William Lane's The Gospel of Mark. On the right, you have an example of how a student has used this material in his or her paper. As you examine it, you'll realize that this is a direct quote. However, there is no indication from the student that this is the case. It is absent quotation marks, and there is no footnote citation. As the reader, I would assume that the idea and the wording of this idea was the product of the student, when in actuality it was taken from another source. This is considered plagiarism. Let's take a look at another example taken from the same source material. In this instance, you will note that the student did properly use the footnote citation. However, the student chose to substitute certain words. One misconception is that if a statement is not fully quoted, that is word for word, then the student is free from having to use quotation marks. This is a misconception, a fallacy. Whenever you quote something, either in part or in whole, you must use quotation marks. And in comparing these two texts, it's clear that the majority of what is being stated was taken from the original source. In this case, the substitution of words is unnecessary. It doesn't amplify, it doesn't give any additional meaning to the original material, and therefore it's unnecessary. The student simply quoted it in its entirety and used proper quotation marks. In this instance, we have an exact quote, and the student has properly used quotation marks, thereby indicating to the reader that the idea and the wording of this idea is not his or her product, but it's borrowed from another source. Unfortunately, the reader does not know what source it's taken from because there is no footnote. Technically, this still constitutes as plagiarism. Again, the rule of thumb: whenever you quote, you must use quotation marks or block quoting if appropriate, and include the proper footnote citation that directs the reader to the actual source of the material. This is an example of what a quotation should look like. Again, using the same source material, the student has properly bracketed the statement in quotation marks, identifying to the reader that the idea as well as the wording of that idea is taken from another source. The student also indicates through the footnote where that material can be found. This is the proper way to cite material in a paper. Another common mistake is improper paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is taking someone else's point of view and condensing or restating it in your own words. In some cases, paraphrasing may be preferred over direct quoting, in that it allows you to reshape the language while retaining the idea in a way that fits the flow of your argument. It also allows the writer to summarize main points without having to resort to lengthy quotes. But keep in mind that there are certain rules of engagement where paraphrasing is concerned. For instance, rearranging words or phrases or substitution of words is not considered proper paraphrase. It is viewed as plagiarism. A good paraphrase should reflect the main idea of the source material with no literary or linguistic resemblance to the original. And like a direct quote, a paraphrase must include the proper footnote citation. Again, even though the student isn't using the exact words, they are borrowing the idea from that source material, and therefore footnote citation is required. Let's take a moment and look at some examples of improper paraphrasing. In this instance, you will note that the student has simply reordered the structure of the statement as indicated by the red brackets. In addition, the student has substituted certain words throughout. This is not what we would consider an adequate paraphrase. In comparison, there is so much of the original material contained in the student's version that it more closely resembles a quote than a paraphrase. We would consider this plagiarism. In this example of improper paraphrasing, word substitution is used throughout. However, the flow of thought is consistent with the original source material. And even though the student uses the proper footnote citation, the structure of the statement is so closely related to the original that it would still be deemed as plagiarism. This is not what we would consider good paraphrase and should be avoided. In this example, the student has captured the main idea of the original material by providing a proper paraphrase as indicated by the yellow text. However, the student has concluded his statement with a direct quote. Even though a footnote citation was provided, the reader is led to believe that the entire statement is a paraphrase. However, only a part of it is. In this case, the student should have paraphrased the entire statement, or at least bracketed the closing remarks in quotation marks. This would still be considered plagiarism. This is an example of a proper paraphrase. As you compare the two texts, you will realize that they are both saying the same thing, but saying it in a different way. That is what a paraphrase should do. Another common mistake is overdependence on sources. It is not uncommon for students whose research and writing skills are deficient to rely too heavily on outside sources for the scope, direction, and content of their research paper. In many cases, the student may employ proper usage and citation of sources, but their final product is nothing more than a compilation of other authors' thoughts and words. The paper is considered plagiarism by Gordon-Conwell faculty because the student fails to demonstrate his or her ability to grapple with the subject matter and to engage other scholars within the respective discipline. This next section of slides is further example of the kinds of problems that we've discussed thus far. However, in this case, it's taken from an actual paper that was submitted. Again, we will follow the same format. On the left, we have the actual source material, and on the right, we have the actual paper that the student submitted. Please keep in mind that the text in green represents the student's contribution, whereas the text in black is taken directly from the original source. On this particular instance, we find the same problem of reordering the structure of the material. This section of material is identical to the original. The only difference is that the student reversed the order of thought with direct quotes throughout. In this example, we encounter much of the same. Weak paraphrases, verbatim quotes with no quotation marks, and the failure to cite one of the sources from which the material was taken. Once again, we have a poor attempt of paraphrasing by using word substitution. There are verbatim quotes throughout with no indication to the reader, i.e. quotation marks, that this material was taken from another source. Again, this is much of what we've seen previously. The last statement is identical with the exception that the order of thought has been reversed. Therefore, it's necessary for the student to add some transitional remarks, which of course is captured in the green text. But by and large, this whole section is a verbatim quote. Unfortunately, that is not communicated to the reader, given the absence of quotation marks and proper footnote citation. And finally, more of the same problems. Verbatim quotes with no quotation marks. Again, the green text on the right represents the student's contribution to the overall discussion of the topic, whereas the black represents the actual source material. There are no quotation marks, and so the reader would assume that the thoughts and how those thoughts are worded are actually ascribed to the writer, or the student in this case, when in actuality they are taken from multiple sources, as we've seen. In this case, the student even used information from a website but forgot to cite it, which is a common problem when students are relying so heavily on other material. In the previous slides, we took a sample of an actual paper, broke it into segments so that we could look at the various problems that had been previously discussed. This is what that paper looked like in its original form. This represents all of those segments put together in the original paper form. Now, again, keep in mind that the green text represents the contribution of the student, and the black text represents the original material taken from other sources. We also noted that at best the green text was in many cases just substitution, and in some cases it was transitional language, but there was very little substance. Now let's assume for a moment that this student throughout this segment of the paper had used perfect style, that is, footnoting where appropriate, quotation marks where necessary, or block quoting, paraphrasing where appropriate, and let's assume for a moment that all of those technical issues were up to par. Even if that were the case, this paper, at least what we're looking at now, would still be considered plagiarism. It would still receive a failing grade at Gordon-Conwell. Why? Because in the end, there is very little about this paper that reveals the thoughts of the student. What the student has produced is a compilation of other people's thoughts and ideas on a particular topic. It does not reflect any observations that the student noted in their research. It doesn't reveal any conclusion that the student may have drawn about those observations, and there is no place in this paper in which the student actually engages with the viewpoints of others. The student simply copied and pasted what other people had to say about a topic. And because of that, and because it lacks any of the student's own thought process, it is deemed plagiarism. Again, over-reliance on other source material, even if all the technical stuff is where it should be in terms of footnoting and paraphrasing, if a student submits a paper that is predominantly the viewpoints of others, then it is considered plagiarism, and it receives a failing grade at Gordon-Conwell. As a graduate student, it's imperative that you develop good research and writing skills. As you develop through your program, more and more you will be assessed on your ability to think critically, to do proper research, and to write as a way of demonstrating your knowledge base. At Gordon-Conwell, research papers and exegesis are designed to further develop students in their research and writing skills, to challenge students to approach their studies with a critical eye, to instill confidence in one's own discerning capabilities, and to establish one's own voice viewed to engaging the world. We want our students to be able to think on their own, not simply to voice what other people think, but to draw their own conclusions based on their understanding of Scripture, the history of our church, and theology proper, and to be able to develop that in such a way that they can in their own voice, with great confidence, be able to engage the world around them.